It's January 10th, 2020. Here's a poem I'd like to share. Something totally irrelevant and nevertheless amusing. This poem by Ogden Nash is called The Strange Case of Mr. Donnybrook's Boredom. Once upon a time, there was a man named Mr. Donnybrook. He was married to a woman named Mrs. Donnybrook. Mr. and Mrs. Donnybrook dearly loved to be bored. Sometimes they were bored at the ballet, other times at the cinema. They were bored riding elephants in India and elevators in the Empire State Building. They were bored in speakeasies during Prohibition and in cocktail lounges after repeal. They were bored by grand dukes and garbage men, debutantes and demi-mondaines, opera singers and Onassis. They scoured the 5 continents and 7 seas in their mad pursuit of boredom. This went on for years and years. One day, Mr. Donnybrook turned to Mrs. Donnybrook. "My dear," he said, "we have reached the end of our rope. We have exhausted every yawn. The world holds nothing more to jade our titillated palates." "Well," said Mrs. Donnybrook, "we might try insomnia." So they tried insomnia. About 2 o'clock the next morning, Mr. Donnybrook said, "My, insomnia certainly is quite boring, isn't it?" Mrs. Donnybrook said, "It certainly was, wasn't it?" Mr. Donnybrook said, "It certainly was." Pretty soon he began to count sheep. Mrs. Donnybrook began to count sheep too. After a while, Mr. Donnybrook said, "Hey, you're counting my sheep. Stop counting my sheep," said Mr. Donnybrook. "Why, the very idea," said Mrs. Donnybrook. "I guess I know my sheep, don't I?" "How?" said Mr. Donnybrook. "They're cattle," said Mrs. Donnybrook. "They're cattle, and longhorns at that. Furthermore," said Mrs. Donnybrook, "us cattle ranchers is sure tired of you sheepmen plumb ruinin' our water. I give you fair warnin'," said Mrs. Donnybrook. "You better get them woolly Gila monsters of yourn back across the Rio Grande afore mornin', or I'm a-goin' to string you up on the nearest cottonwood." "Caramba!" sneered Mr. Donnybrook. "This is free range, no?" "No," said Mrs. Donnybrook, "not for sheepmen." She strung him up on the nearest cottonwood. Mr. Donnybrook had never been so bored in his life. And that was The Strange Case of Mr. Donnybrook's Boredom by Ogden Nash. I'm Richard Henzel. Thanks for listening.